I'll just start by introducing myself. I am Hilary Milward. I'm one of the many dietitians with the Hamilton Family Health team. And today we're going to be talking about food and mood and some of the associations that we know are really kind of highly correlated when it comes to what we're eating and how we're feeling. So I am a registered dietitian with the family health team, as I said. And so I work at about 6 different doctors' offices, and I also have my master's degree in applied nutrition. And yeah, I'm just really happy to be here, and I'll let Kate introduce herself as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Park. I'm also a registered dietitian with the Hamilton Family Health team. I work at a variety of locations across the city, as well as I take part in a number of the groups. Some of you might know me from the Cooking for Better Health series. Yeah, also happy to be here to talk about food and mood. I'm just going to run you through a couple of things. There is a chat option on the side. If you have any specific questions you want to ask us about food or mood, please feel free to type that into the chat box. We may save most questions kind of towards the end, but if there's anything really relevant, I will be keeping an eye on that chat and try to answer them as we go along. There's also a section where we're going to have kind of some true or false interaction questions. It will come up as a poll. And what I'll do is I will send that out each time there's a question, and you'll have the option to kind of click whether you think it's true or false, just to kind of shake things up a little bit for today. So I think we're probably ready to get started, Hilary, so I will let you take it away with the start of our presentation.
Lovely, thank you. So I just wanted to make a couple of comments before we kind of jump into today's content. And I'd just like to address a couple of things. And one is, we're talking about food and our mental health today. And I do think it's important to know and to say that, if you are really struggling, that you should, talk to your doctor and seek out some help through your support system. So that might have been what has actually led you to this webinar. It's possible that, you've already reached out to your support system and that's why you're here. But, if you haven't done that yet and you are really struggling, I would encourage you to talk to your family physician, to talk to your mental health counselor. So through the family health team, you should have access to both a dietitian and a mental health counselor, one way or another. So just keep that in mind. If you haven't really reached out to anybody yet, that's a good idea to do so, especially if you're really struggling, because I know this is kind of a weird time. And the other thing that I wanted to mention before we really dive into today's content is just an understanding that, when we're talking about like our health and lifestyle and some of the things that help us to feel a little bit better, is that eating and our food and our diet and our nutrition is really just like one kind of pillar, right? It's one area where we can put some work. But, when it comes to lifestyle, we're not going to be talking a lot about sleep today or about physical activity, but it is important to know that these things are also really important. So it's possible that we might, get into this in some other webinars, but today we're really just focusing on the food piece, but that doesn't mean that it's the only lifestyle piece that is going to help to kind of be that foundation for a nice solid ground. And I think that's really what I think of those things as: nutrition, some daily movement of some kind that feels good for you, and a good kind of sleep routine can really help to just make you feel a little bit better. And like I said, have you stand on some solid ground so that the work you do with your mental health counselor, with your medications, with yourself, ends up being a much more productive and helpful process when you've got that foundation down. So I just wanted to mention those 2 things before we kind of dive into today. And I just love this little quote that the best way to eat is one that makes you feel healthy and happy. So I like that. So let's see here. Okay. So today we are going to cover really 2 main topics. So like I said, we're zeroing right in on nutrition. And the first thing we're going to talk about is how the food that we eat can actually change the chemistry of our brains, how our brains function, and therefore how we feel. So this is a really new kind of emerging science. This is not something that we've just been sitting on and keeping from you guys. This is definitely new and up and coming, and some really cool things that are happening in terms of the understanding of the association between our diet and our mental health. So we're also going to review some strategies that help you to incorporate some healthier eating habits when your moods are actually low, right? So, you know, we often have this list of things that we should be doing, quote unquote, and our goal here is not to add more stress and to add more things that you feel you should be doing, but rather giving you some tangible tools that can help you when you are feeling low, and just giving you some really simple strategies that we can kind of focus on. Because sometimes, you know, when you're dealing with depression, when you're dealing with mental health issues, it's like sometimes just leaving the house is difficult, or getting up out of bed is difficult. So we just want to address that. We know that that is, you know, part of it. So we want to make sure that it's nice and easy for you. So, sorry, when I hit next, it's just a little bit delayed. Okay. So what we do know is that nutrition does matter. So like I was saying, there is some new and really exciting research that's coming out, and some evidence that now suggests that diet is just as important for our mental health as it is for our physical health. It can be very protective, and that, you know, when your diet is not great, or when your eating habits are not great, it can make you feel worse. And we kind of inherently know this, but we don't always think of it specifically for our mental health. And one way I think about this is that, you know, I was in person with you guys, I would ask you to like raise your hands if you've kind of heard that, you know, depression and anxiety are a result of our like chemical imbalances in our brain, right? So we may have heard of this kind of out in the world. And so we know this is true, but I think sometimes we hear that and we say, okay, well, you know, how do we actually change those chemical imbalances? And this is part of what nutrition does. It actually can affect your brain chemistry. And we don't always think about our food in this way, but what we're eating can absolutely have a huge impact on our brain chemistry. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, but we're going to try not to get too much into science. Like really, we could talk for like hours and hours about some of this stuff, but we're just trying to keep it concise and just kind of dip our toes into the water a little bit. So some of the ways that our diet and our eating habits can actually affect the brain are one in the production of neurotransmitters. So this is a really cool thing that we don't often think about. So I'm going to talk a little sciencey for a second, and hopefully you can hang in there. So when it comes to neurotransmitters, these are just little signaling molecules in our brain. And when you think about things like serotonin, this might be a semi-familiar term for some of you. So serotonin is kind of like that happy molecule in our brain. So if there's the appropriate levels of serotonin, we feel better, right? And so what we know is that serotonin doesn't just like come up out of nowhere. It doesn't just like magically appear. We need the raw materials and the building blocks to actually make our own serotonin. And, you know, if we've heard of the term tryptophan before, we might think of this in terms of turkey, because it's like the thing that makes you feel sleepy. But tryptophan is actually the precursor, the raw materials that we need to build serotonin. So this is just one example of how this happens all the time. And you can think of, you know, your proteins and your healthy fats as those raw materials, and your vitamins and minerals as like the worker bees that make all of these things happen. Our vitamins and minerals also help to reduce something called oxidative stress, which is just a fancy term for like the damage that happens just from like basically existing. Every time we, you know, our cells divide and, you know, chemicals and chemistry is happening in our bodies and in our brains, this can result in some oxidative stress, which is hard on the system. And so our vitamins and minerals help to combat that. They also help to reduce inflammation. They are a big part of the integrity of our brain cells. So in specific, you know, example of that would be our omega-3 fats. And so our omega-3 fats are, you know, part of what helps to actually make and build our brain cells. And, you know, other things like our gut microbiome. So when you think about the healthy bacteria that live in your gut, we now know, again, a lot of new research coming out about this, but how the bacteria that are in our gut actually, you know, have a big impact on how we feel. It's called the gut-brain connection, right? And this is also true in the opposite way, whereas if we're really stressed or anxious, sometimes our digestion can be like, you know, an absolute mess. So it's just, there's so many different ways in that having a, you know, at least somewhat healthy diet can be really, really helpful when it comes to actually giving you the raw ingredients to help yourself, right? So these are just a few of the ways that what we eat can actually have an impact on our brain. And it's for these reasons as well that, you know, eating in a, you know, particular way, which we're going to talk a little bit about today, that eating in a particular way can actually also help with other brain functions. So just regular cognitive function, but also in terms of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So there's a lot of like kind of similar patterns. So you can also use some of these strategies and tools to actually just help keep your brain healthy across the board, not just specifically depression and not just specifically anxiety or anything like that. Okay, so when we think about some of these things, sorry, like I said, there's a little bit of a delay. You know, they've actually done some studies, and in particular, something called randomized controlled trials. That's what RCT stands for. And so there was a study done called the SMILE study, and this was, like I say, a randomized controlled trial. And essentially what they did is they took a relatively large group of people who basically had symptoms of depression, right? They were actively depressed. And then they, you know, took half of this group and they just kind of put them in a control group where they had like some peer support. And then they took the other half of this group and they gave them like a Mediterranean style pattern of eating. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like, but basically just like a healthy diet. And so, you know, when you look at these two groups and how they fared over time, they found that the group that ended up getting just the diet intervention, so they're not getting anything else fancy, felt significantly better. Their depression scores at the end of the study were significantly better. And as you see here, a third, so 32% of all the participants actually reported very minimal or no symptoms of depression after eating this way. And so this just goes to show you that, you know, what we eat can really have that, you know, profound impact on how we feel, our energy levels, and how our brains are functioning, and therefore how our mental health is doing. So it's a really exciting study that a lot of us love to talk about. And it's, like I say, this is all new stuff. So this is all very new science. So there's still like a long way to go, and there's still lots of different ways that we can start to assess this. But it is a really impressive feat, I would say. So what does a, you know, Mediterranean style diet look like? So, you know, really what we're thinking about is, you know, a diet that's rich in some of these healthy foods that help to support a healthier brain. So really we're thinking things like fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds, legumes, whole grains. And then if you look at the olive oil, those are all plant-based, you know, things that we can add into our diet. So we're adding more plants into our diet. And then, you know, also fish, because of those omega-3 fats. They're wonderful for the brain. And then, of course, even a little bit of dairy, even if it's like lower fat dairy. And then we want to try and limit some processed foods, fast foods, sugary foods, things like that. Having said that, I think it's really important to mention, I don't like, sometimes even just like having that X there, it feels a little bit intense, but you know, one thing that I think is really important when we're actually in the thick of it, right? When we are feeling not great, our mental health is not in a good place, we're feeling depressed or anxious, I think a really good thing to put some attention to is to actually focus on adding, right? adding things to the diet that help you to feel a little bit better. Because remember, what we want is that those nutrients, those raw ingredients, those building blocks. So don't worry if the rest of your diet is kind of imperfect. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we progress. But you know, let's not worry too much about all the things that we shouldn't be doing and just focus on adding to the diet. And I think that's a really nice, gentle place to start that can still affect you and still help you to feel better. So I think that's, you know, an important piece to keep in mind. So yeah, we have a big X through some of these things, but you know, do bear in mind that it's not this hard and fast rule, and it's really about first adding into the diet. Okay, so we have a little poll here. I'll get Kate to set that up for us. So I'd love to hear what you guys think, you know, after seeing a little bit of that food list. What do you think, you know, if you look at these pictures, is the most similar to a Mediterranean style of eating? So we have, you know, eggs and bacon and waffles. We've got the toast, the nut butter, and the cantaloupe or the cereal.
Just giving people a few minutes to respond. I can see people are clicking now.
Awesome.
Okay, how many participants have we got? We've got about 22. I'm seeing about 17, 18 responses. So 6% of people are saying the eggs, bacon, and waffle. 11% are saying the cereal, toast, and orange juice. And 83% are saying the toast, nut butter, and cantaloupe.
Absolutely, yes. So I would say, you know, the majority is right. I think we might have had one person in there who was hoping that we were going to say eggs, bacon, and waffles, but so yeah, we do have, you know, the one in the bottom corner there with, you know, a nice hearty bread, you know, a natural nut butter, some fruit. That's, you know, a nice kind of picture of what a Mediterranean diet might look like. Because sometimes I think we can assume that it means we need to eat pasta and olives and feta cheese and like eat like Mediterranean tasting foods, but it's really more about keeping that foundation, right? So if we move on here, I'll get rid of these things. So, you know, if we really think about that, the foundation of that Mediterranean style of eating is really those fruits, those vegetables, those, you know, mostly whole grains, olive oil, or beans and legumes. So that would be things like black beans and kidney beans and chickpeas, nuts and seeds. So these are really going to be the foundation of our diet. And then you can see, you know, up at the top, you know, meats and sweets might be like a little bit less often. So this is kind of the way we like to think about a Mediterranean style diet. So we're going to get into some of our true and false questions now that we've kind of got you warmed up a little bit. And it's going to kind of lead us into some of our other topics that we'd like to talk about. But I'm going to pass it over on to Kate and let her get into some of these questions for you.
Thank you very much. All right. Very thorough coverage of kind of the Mediterranean diet and the impact of food. So let's talk about some specifics. So the first poll I'm asking you, and this is true or false,
you want to turn your thing on? You want to turn your video on?
Oh, turn my video on? I'm sorry. I thought we were sharing. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Doesn't matter. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry, just because I thought people would be watching your screen still. You're still sharing your screen, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I can leave it on. It doesn't really matter.
Okay.
Okay. And so let's start with the simple true or false. Dehydration can affect my mood. True or false? So I'm just going to launch this poll. Very quick responses there. So the majority of people are saying that they believe that it is true, and it actually is. When you think about it, a very large percentage of our body is made out of water. So it would make sense that being dehydrated would have an impact. It actually has an impact on a lot of things. It can have an impact on digestion, but it also has a big impact on your brain function, because if your brain is actually not getting the right fluids, if it's not receiving nutrients due to dehydration, typical symptoms of dehydration can include things like feeling restless, irritable, or fatigue. So if you're somebody who experiences a lot of fatigue on a regular basis and you're not great about drinking fluids, this is an area you might want to focus on. Now, we've all heard the old adage that we need to get 8 glasses of water a day. It's actually often a little bit more than that, and it's in cups. So when we're saying cups, we're talking about like a measuring cup, 250 ml. And for people, the amount of fluid you need in a day will vary depending on your age, depending on your size, your activity level, but typically it's somewhere between 9 to 13 cups each day. Now, the good news is that coffee and tea does hydrate to a point. A lot of people assume that first cup of coffee is going to dehydrate them. We usually see dehydration with coffee and tea at higher consumption rates. So usually if you're having, say, like excessive, like 4 cups. But you do get hydration from there. You also get hydration from things like broths, so things like soups. The big thing we want to limit is too much caffeine. So, you know, if you're having more than 4 cups of coffee a day, or if you're having excessive sugar, because liquid sugar can also play a big role. It's often very easy to consume a lot of sugar in beverages. So we want to have more of those sugar-free options, things like water, plain tea, even things like milk, which is very hydrating. So yes, hydration is going to be really key, because unfortunately, when you are dehydrated, your brain is the first part of your body that's going to be affected. So something to think about if you feel like you are experiencing some of these symptoms. We're not suggesting that rehydrating is going to eliminate all these symptoms, but it certainly can have a very large impact. And as you can see, just looking at some of these images here, that certain beverages that contain sugar can contain quite a bit. So another visual, instead of the 6 teaspoons, for example, that would be in a double coffee, would be to think about those little packets of sugar you get at a restaurant. Each one of those packets is like a teaspoon. So a can of cola, for example, has like 10.5 teaspoons of sugar in it. And when guidelines are suggesting for most of us, when it comes to added sugar, we should be limiting ourselves to 6 to 9 teaspoons a day. You can see you can use it up very quickly in a beverage, which is why we encourage more of those sugar-free beverages. Okay, let's move on to our next question. So, does the body use sugar in fruit and fruit juice the same, true or false? Great. Thank you for responding so quickly, everyone.
You're good.
Okay. So the majority of people say that this is false. And if we can move to our next slide, please. And you would be right. So not all sugars are created equal. Some sugars will absorb very quickly, like we were mentioning with sugary beverages like pops and energy drinks and things like that. The body's able to absorb liquid sugar very quickly. Also, the tendency when we consume sugar in liquid form, like in a juice, is that it can be very concentrated. You can end up with a lot of sugar in a small amount. The comparison I always like to use is it's very difficult to sit down and eat 4 oranges. It's very easy to drink the juice from 4 oranges. And so typically that's because what does an orange have that orange juice doesn't? Well, it's got all the fiber. It's got all of the, which tends to keep us full, but fiber also slows down how quickly our body absorbs certain nutrients. So what we want to do is we want to try and choose foods that are going to enter our bloodstream more slowly, so we don't get, like in this diagram you can see here, there's this peak And that red peak represents a food that absorbs very quickly in the bloodstream, maybe like a fruit juice, whereas the lower one, that little yellow one, is there more of our low response. So you see the words high GI, that stands for high glycemic index versus low glycemic index. And the glycemic index is a scale we use to measure how quickly the sugars in foods we consume turn into sugar in the blood. And the faster something does that, the more of a spike we get in our blood sugars. But as you can see, if you have a very dramatic spike in a blood sugar, it's usually followed by a big dip in your blood sugars as well. And for anyone who has diabetes and experienced hypoglycemia, they can tell you that besides kind of feeling shaky and jittery, some common symptoms would include things like feeling irritable, confusion. There can be some kind of psychological impacts that come with having low blood sugars as well. A lot of times when we educate people on high blood sugars, we also describe some symptoms of irritability and mood changes. So what we're trying to say is the more even we can keep our blood sugars through the day, the less of that kind of dramatic, those intense mood symptoms will occur, which is why we're encouraging people to try and choose foods that are moderate to low glycemic index. And if you want to learn more about which foods fall into those categories, the general rule of thumb is the less processed something is, the higher fiber it is, it's usually lower on the scale. But there's a great chart available through diabetes.ca, through Diabetes Canada, where you can actually see some of those foods to give you some more examples. So there's a question, sorry, I'm just seeing there's a question here from one of the attendees about beverages, and they're asking about diet and caffeine-free. I'm assuming this is in reference to that beverage question from before. Are diet and caffeine-free options any better? My answer to that would be that the caffeine-free certainly would have some benefits, as too much caffeine can have an impact on mood, as well as dehydration if we're getting way too much of it. Now, the diet beverages often come with artificial sweeteners in them. And Hilary, I don't know if you want to speak to this at all as well, but a lot of the times we kind of look at diet sugar similar to regular sugar in the sense that a little bit is probably okay, but we don't want to be excessive with that either, as where you're having regular sugar beverages, there's that effect on spikes in blood sugars and just getting too much sugar into the body, which can have other negative health effects. We also see that with artificial sweeteners, too much of them can have side effects too. Some typical symptoms people experience from excessive diet sugars can include things like headaches, stomach upset, increased cravings. Hilary, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to that.
I think you catched it. You got it all.
Okay. Wonderful. So hopefully that answers your question, JP. Thank you for asking it. Let's move on to our next polling question.
Sorry.
Oh, okay.
I saw the answer.
Okay, well, for anybody who wasn't looking away from the screen, let's do this one. So, true or false? Recent research reports probiotics in fermented foods and supplements can improve gas, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, and mood. To be fair, you kind of hinted at this a little bit at the beginning of the presentation as well. Okay, I think we can kind of pause there. So I'll just share the results from here. Sorry to cut off those that maybe wanted to answer the questions. I just want to make sure we have time at the end for questions you might have as well. So the answer is, next slide.
Next slide.
It's true. So this is actually an area I'm particularly interested in. We're very blessed at the Hamilton Family Health team to have one of the gurus of probiotics with us named Dragana. She's one of our pharmacists. She actually writes the probiotic guidelines every year, and this is a very new and exciting kind of area. We used to think, and so just to clarify, probiotics are types of bacteria that can have positive effects on the body in specific doses. So this is probably a gross fact for everyone, but most of us are carrying a couple pounds of bacteria inside of us that are actually keeping us alive. We used to think that the bacteria in our body's only role was to affect digestion, to help with things like constipation, keeping bad bacteria at bay to prevent food poisonings, but what we've discovered is they play so many more roles in our health. They actually affect how we absorb vitamins, minerals, and nutrients. They can affect vaginal health, oral health. They can even affect how our body's energy and metabolism. And so they've really kind of developed this symbiotic relationship with us. And what we've discovered is, as Hilary mentioned, it's a two-way street in that when we have, a healthy diet, when we manage our stress, we can encourage good bacteria in the body. But when we say have a lot of stress, or maybe we have poor health behaviors, we can negatively impact them, and then that affects the whole body. So certain foods may help because what they do is they encourage that good bacteria development. So fermented foods have some of these natural bacteria in them. So a couple of examples we have here include kefirs, sauerkrauts, yogurts that have live cultures, so actual probiotic yogurt. So to be clear, not all yogurts are probiotic, but all yogurts are fermentable, are fermented. So fermented foods have benefits to them, but if you see a yogurt that says it's probiotic, what that means is they have intentionally added extra specific bacteria into that yogurt to cause an effect. And there's different strains out there, and different strains do different benefits. So the comparison I always like to use is kind of look at your probiotics like you do vitamins. Just taking a vitamin for the sake of taking a vitamin isn't necessarily helpful. We take specific vitamins for specific conditions. Same thing with probiotics. Taking a general probiotic, it may have a benefit. Eating fermentable foods certainly is helpful. But if you're taking a probiotic, it's actually a good thing to review with your healthcare team, because if you're trying to treat specific issues, so for example, if you are trying to take a probiotic to improve mood, there are specific strains that have been linked to improving mood, but you need to make sure you are taking that strain in the right dose, and there are certain products that carry those lines and others that don't. But if you're just taking fermentable foods for general well-being and improving your nutrition, absolutely there's no harm in doing that. But the reason I bring this up is probiotics can be terribly expensive, and you really need to make sure that if you are using them, you are getting value out of them. There's nothing worse than spending hundreds of dollars on supplements and products that may not be doing anything for you. So it's definitely something to review with your healthcare team. And pharmacists, dietitians, family doctors, we're always happy to talk about that stuff with you. But the one example we have related to food and mood is Combiotic, which has 2 specific strains in it that have actually been shown to have a positive effect on mood. Now, it's not that if you take this, your mood's suddenly going to improve. Most of these products, when it comes to mood improvement, are in conjunction with other therapies, talk therapy, mindfulness, doing other sort of therapies as well. It's not kind of like it's not like a pill that makes you happy, I guess is what I'm trying to emphasize here. But it can certainly support helping you to progress through different moods and conditions you might be experiencing. Okay, so let's move on to our next question.
Sorry, there's a delay, and if I hit it twice, it's going to go.
Okay. So, true or false, going too long without eating can make you feel drained, irritable, or bring on feelings of anxiety?
Man, you guys are so good. We should have asked harder questions.
I know. Okay, let's end that there. All right, so the majority of you feel this one is true, and you would be correct. I feel like there was an amazing marketing campaign with, I think it was Snickers, the chocolate bar, where they were kind of poking fun at this reality, the idea of being hangry, or, being hungry and angry at the same time. And a lot of that, again, has to do with kind of that role of blood sugars affecting mood. Are we moving on to the next slide? Or maybe not?
There it
Oh,
goes.
there we go. Yes. Okay. So yes, the answer is that it is true, because, and as I was mentioning with these commercials, what they were showing is people, you know, that were in a bad mood and then they eat a Snickers and they feel better. And we're not suggesting that you need to eat a Snickers to fight your hangry. We're just suggesting you need to eat regularly, because when you go long periods of time without eating, your blood sugars are going to fluctuate. Especially in your muscles, your brain. So some people experience, you know, achiness, fatigue, difficulty focusing, mood changes. And by eating regularly through the day, you can prevent these mood changes, or at least reduce the impact of them. So for people that experience a lot of anxiety, this is often one of the first things I focus on. And it's very challenging because often when you're feeling a lot of anxiety, sometimes your appetite can be negatively affected. And you're not feeling hungry. But the problem is not eating often makes it worse. So even just getting in the habit of trying to have small regular meals through the day can help reduce some of these symptoms and help you work towards eating regular meals in the day. All right, what have we got next? I keep forgetting to hit the stop share results. Okay, here we go. Oh, this is a good one. All right, so magnesium is an important mineral for sleep and the production of brain neurotransmitters. So everybody that responded said that it's true, and you would be right. Magnesium plays a huge role in our sleep. And actually, magnesium deficiency is much more common than you would think, due to the fact that a lot of us aren't eating as much of it as we used to. Hilary, could you go to the next slide? Oh, there we go. Thank you. So typical places that we get a lot of our magnesium from include things like nuts and seeds, leafy greens, whole grains can have quite a bit, and just with the kind of shifts in diet over the decades, more convenience foods being available, magnesium levels have kind of gone down in our diet. Or for many people, they are on things like medications that can interact with magnesium, prevent them from absorbing it or use it up. Magnesium plays a lot of different roles in the body. It affects our bone health. A lot of us, when we think of bone health, we think of calcium and vitamin D. But magnesium also is part of that building block process. Also muscle function. It helps with the contraction and movement of muscles. And in particular, what we find is those with low magnesium often have more disrupted sleep. So it's very important that we make sure that we are getting magnesium rich in the diet. And so do I recommend a magnesium supplement to people? Sometimes it depends on your personal situation. It's definitely something to review with your healthcare team. Magnesium is also something that, depending on your symptoms and your health history, they may actually test for. But it's definitely something that can be appropriate as part of a combination of supplements if you are deficient. But I will tell you right now, a handful of green pumpkin seeds gives you all the magnesium you need for a day. So it's not hard to get the magnesium. We just need to think about incorporating more of these foods. Regarding, sorry, I'm seeing a specific question on a different health conditions just come up. And so Carrie, I will be happy to answer that at the end for you specifically. If you're looking to increase magnesium, regarding, you know, if you have certain food sensitivities. Magnesium is in a lot of different foods. And what I would recommend is, depending on the state of your digestion, most of these foods would likely be appropriate if you see the ones that are on the slide. Hilary, if you could just go back quickly. Most of these should be tolerable. And yeah, because often a high fiber diet is recommended for those that have things like Crohn's anyways, just as long as they're not in a state of flare. So there you go. The pumpkin seeds would definitely be a good fit. Great question. Okay, let's move on to our, oh, hang on. I just closed the wrong, hit the wrong button.
You can also get magnesium through Epsom salts baths too, if you don't like any foods.
Oh my goodness. So yes, one of the common issues with taking a magnesium supplement is some people will find that their stomachs are very sensitive. Magnesium can cause diarrhea in high doses, especially certain types of it. There's some that are better digested than others. And for those with stomach issues, magnesium salts, like Epsom salts, you can actually absorb it through your skin. So like a good, is it 1 or 2 cups of Epsom salts? I always forget.
Like maybe a cup and a half.
It's about a cup and a half in a hot bath, and you do that for, I think it's like 4 to 6 weeks, and you can actually correct a magnesium deficiency with that without actually having to get a magnesium supplement. It's actually faster than taking the supplements. We tend to absorb it better through our skin. The downside is you got to have a hot bath every night. So I mean, if you're into bubble baths, it's a win-win. But for others, it might not be practical depending on your living situation. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to our next one. True or false? Protein and carbohydrates work together to boost serotonin levels in the brain, which helps with mood, sleep, and feelings of joy. Just trying to be mindful of the time here.
We can always turn our second part into our second part, a part 2.
True. That's very true. There's just so much great information when it comes to food and mood. You know, the old saying, you are what you eat. Well, what you eat can affect how you feel as well. Like it really is impactful. All right. Here we go. So the majority of you feel like this is true, and you would be correct in this case. Remember what Hilary said at the beginning about those building blocks. So carbohydrates and proteins do work together to create these key neurotransmitters which affect our overall mood. So things like tryptophan, that turkey, the turkey amino acid plays a role in serotonin, which affects, if you don't have enough of it, it makes it difficult for sleep. It can affect mood. Tyrosine, which is another amino acid that creates dopamine, which can affect our motivation and enthusiasm. And then glutamine, which is another protein amino acid. So proteins basically break down into these little amino acids, and glutamine, when we don't have enough of it, can cause increased sense of anxiety, irritability, and then so between the two of these actually help to build all of those key these neurotransmitters for our brain. Now, a lot of us are not getting enough of these proteins in our diet, and one of the questions I often get is, should I use a protein supplement? Well, not necessarily. What's important is to make sure you're getting your protein from a variety of foods. So remember what I said, proteins break down into amino acids. Different protein-based foods have different amino acids. No protein-based food has all of them. And so if you're only getting your protein from one source, like a protein supplement's often made from whey, which has a whole bunch of different amino acids in it, you might be missing key amino acids to build some of these neurotransmitters. So it's really good to get a variety of proteins from things like beans and nuts and seeds and eggs and fish and yogurt. And it's kind of like when we talk about vegetables, we say get a variety of the colors. Well, when it comes to proteins, get a variety of the proteins, because different ones are going to give you different benefits. But overall, we could benefit from having regular, not just regular meals during the day, but regular meals that contain a combination of proteins and carbohydrates. So yes, I think that kind of covers us there. All right. Oh, my pull button keeps moving. There we go. All right. So our next one. Okay. Cod is a good source of omega-3 fats, a healthy type of fat that reduces inflammation and is associated with lower rates of depression.
Ooh, we
divided the crowd a little bit here.
makes me happy. Oh, damn it.
Sorry, I'm just seeing another question about the variety of proteins.
Mhm.
Ideally, it's good to get a variety of proteins over the day, but I mean, if you're getting them over a week, that's also okay. What we want to avoid is, say, for example, only getting our proteins from one source all the time, right? Just because you might be missing out on key amino acids. All right. Sorry about that. And so you guys were split right down the middle, and I get it. We kind of tricked you here. Oh, that was not changed. So it says true. It's actually false. The reason it's false is that cod is actually not a great source of omega-3s. It's a very lean fish. It's still very nutritious for a lot of different reasons, but it's not high in the omega-3s. So I'm sorry, that's a little bit off. There are a number. So omega-3 is a type of fat. It's an essential fat that we can't actually produce. We need to get it from outside of our body. Like, there's a lot of nutrients our body is very versatile at producing itself, but omega-3s are something that we need to get from sources like nuts and seeds and fish. The type of omega-3 that's in fish, also known as EPA and DHA, is particularly good for brain health. So we're looking at oily fish, which is why this slide's actually false, because cod is not an oily fish. Our oily fish that have a lot of these omega-3s include things like salmon, mackerel, herring, sardines, trout. You can get a little omega-3 from some leaner fish. So for example, tuna is a decent source. You can also get some from even our shellfish have a little bit of omega-3 in them. For our non-fish lovers out there, there are other options. You can get omega-3s from omega-3 eggs, walnuts, flax seeds, and chia seeds. Not all nuts and seeds have omega-3s, and the type of omega-3 found in these types of foods is called ALA. And what our body does is it takes the ALA and it converts it over to EPA and DHA. So it turns it over into the type that we can use. The problem is our body isn't the most efficient at converting it, so we do lose some. So you often have to eat quite a bit more of these foods to get an equivalent amount of those omega-3 benefits. And one of the questions I often get is, how do you make an omega-3 egg? Well, what you do is you feed a chicken all of those nuts and seeds you see on the screen. They are much better at converting that ALA than we are, and then it gets deposited into the egg, and then we get the benefits. So yes, definitely we want to try and include these fatty fish. At least 2 to 3 servings a week is what we're aiming for, and a serving size is roughly about 3.5 ounces to 4 ounces. So usually it's just a little bit under the size of the palm of your hand, and this does include fresh fish. It includes canned fish, so things like canned salmon still has that omega-3. One of the warnings I give people, though, is if you're getting fish packed in oil, like a sardine or a tuna or salmon, and you drain that oil off, you are draining some of the omega-3 off. So you're better to get that fish packed in water if you're not going to be using it with the oil, or just keep the oil on. A lot of these canned fish, they're packing them in things like olive oil, and as Hilary mentioned at the beginning, olive oil can be very good for our heart health, those healthy fats. So don't shy away from leaving that on. Plus, it gives it a little bit more flavor, right? Absolutely. All right. So do we have any more of these bowls left? Oh, we do. Okay. Let's go back in here. Oh, this is the last one here. So true or false, vitamin D is a common deficiency in Canada and has been linked to increased risk of depression and bipolar disorder.
I feel like some people are guessing on these and they are still learning.
Okay. Right, just for the sake of time, I'm going to wrap it up there. So the majority of you are saying it's true, and you would be right. The reason we have such high rates of vitamin D deficiency here in Canada is strictly location, location, location. As you may have noticed over the winter, we don't get a whole lot of sunlight for a good chunk of the year. And the main source for vitamin D for the majority of humans is from the sun. And even when we are getting sun exposure, often because we're so far north, it's so indirect, we're not getting as much as you would expect. That, and there is the increased concerns with things like skin cancer. So a lot of us are wearing sunscreens, which also prevents the absorption of significant absorption of vitamin D. And that's why we tend to fortify it into foods, in particular into milk is one of our key areas that we get it. And we do get a little bit from fish, but it is limited. So the majority of Canadians do benefit from vitamin D supplementation over the winter. Just to help keep levels up. Most of us tend to tap out of vitamin D by Christmas time, just because of how poor the sun is often through the fall and winter. And again, vitamin D deficiency isn't just put us at risk for bone health problems, but it also impacts our mental health. It's actually been linked with things like bipolar disorder. So making sure that you have adequate levels of vitamin D is important for a variety of health reasons, including improving overall mood. So something to think about. Now, we used to test for vitamin D in blood work, and it used to be covered, but they don't do it as often because what they've discovered is the majority of us are vitamin D deficient. It is something you can pay to have tested. But again, most of us benefit from doing some sort of vitamin D supplementation over the winter regardless. Right, Hilary, I think that's it for the true or false question. So I'm going to hand it over to you. We did start about 5 minutes late, so I think we can take a few more minutes to go through a little bit more of this information, if that's okay.
Okay. So I think, well, a lot of what we don't cover today will likely, I'll open up my camera here. A lot of what we didn't cover today, we will very likely cover in a part 2. As you've noticed, there's so much that we can talk about when it comes to food and mood, and we didn't really get a chance to talk about too many of those tangible strategies that we can really, kind of use to implement some of these things. Because like I said, oftentimes, we've got this great list of, kind of summary list here that we need our protein and our carbohydrates and our fats and our vitamins and our minerals and our fluids. And, these things are all so important, but on a practical level, it can be very challenging to get all these things in when you are actually feeling a bit low. So, when it comes down to it, healthy eating does help you to feel a little bit better. It helps you to have more energy and stabilize your mood. But we also now know, based on, a growing mountain of research, that eating, reasonably well can reduce your risk of depression, anxiety, and other common health conditions. And so, if you don't have a connection with your dietitian, or if you don't have a dietitian, there's, hopefully some ways where we can give you a little bit more information. But, if you are part of the family health team, I do encourage you to reach out to your dietitian. But certainly when it comes to these things, we know that eating reasonably well can help us. But like I say, don't worry about being perfect. One thing that we do know is helpful is a little bit of mindful eating. And I'm actually not going to get too much into that today, because I feel like it can just go on forever. And there's so much that we can really cover. And, looking at the time, it's, almost 1 hour.
Why don't we take this just 5 minutes now to answer any questions people have? And I just want to emphasize that we are going to have another food and mood session. It's going to be in June. So, because I can see one of the questions is, when will we hear about part 2? And so I think we're looking at tentatively middle to end of June. For those who have been accessing these webinars, if you go to the hamiltonfht.ca website, so I'm just going to type it in here. So on there's a button for groups and workshops, and if you click on that, you can actually see all the individual seminars that are coming up. It's being updated regularly, so you will be able to see when the next food and mood session is coming up. I think maybe we take the last 5 minutes here just to answer any questions people have. I see we have one more from Carrie, and I just want to make sure we cover that. And I want to let you know, we are going to have this presentation, and we will talk more strategies at that time. Mm-hmm. So I've written the name of the site, hamiltonfht.ca, in the chat. Oh, hang on. I'm going to just type that in here. Oops, I don't want to send that to Angela. Hang on, it's not showing up. Hamiltonfht.ca. There you go. All right, so definitely no problem. So we will save the rest of these slides for part 2. We promise that we will, that way we can spend a bit more time talking about strategies.
Yeah.
One of the questions we have, Hilary, is what about vitamin D supplements for kids, and how it plays a role in their mood?
It's a good question. They probably haven't done like specific studies on children's mood. I mean, this is such a, like, again, this is all a really growing field, but you know, we do know that, you know, all Canadians do need vitamin D. So that includes kids. It's just the dose would be different, my guess would be. And, you know, they might not need as much as us. And if you're unsure if you should supplement or how much to supplement, I would ask your doctor or your registered dietitian if you have access to one.
And Angelina, to quickly answer your question, this presentation will be available after they are recording it, so you will be able to click on the link afterwards and rewatch it. I think that's the way they're doing all of the nutrition webinars at this time, so you can always go back and look at the link afterwards. Do you have any sample menus for diets to incorporate the Mediterranean diet? Not specifically during this presentation, but if you have access to one of the registered dietitians at the Hamilton Family Health Team, they could definitely guide you towards that. Oh, thank you so much for the lovely words. I'm just taking a look here. Oh, you guys are so sweet. All right, so we're mostly getting some things. So if you have any further questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, but I think that's where we're going to kind of wrap things up for today, everyone. Again, I feel like we covered a lot of really great information about, you know, the importance of those key nutrients. And I think the overall message, like Hilary was saying, is that it's focus on what needs to be added, not taken away. So much of our culture right now when it comes to eating is about restricting, limiting, dieting, and I think we're missing a really key piece about, you know, what is our body missing, what does our body need, and if we focus a little bit more on that, that is what's going to be the most impactful when it comes to our mood. Because, you know, you can't have balanced positive mood if your body's deprived. It's very hard if you're running on empty.
And we don't want to use diet as like another layer of stress, another thing that we have to worry about. This is here to help you make you feel better. That's really our main goal, is to give you that foundation so that you can help yourself and you can just feel a little bit better. So we don't want to make diet a stressful thing and something that you feel guilty about. So, you know, next time we'll talk a little bit more strategy based, and we'll try and figure out ways so we can actually implement some of these things, and maybe talk about mindful eating and maybe physical activity, sleep, a little bit more on those things as well. Okay, so thank you everybody. We're so glad that you came and appreciate your participation, and yeah, we're just glad to be here.
Yes. All right, everyone, have a great day. Enjoy that fabulous sun. Go get a little bit of vitamin D outside. All right, and we will talk to you soon. All the best.